Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Pinnacle. We are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Chris Hewer this afternoon and this morning in England. He's joining us from the UK, and as I have already introduced Dr. Hewer in my post, he is an expert on Islamic studies and on interfaith relations, and he is a theologian. So, from what I understand, Dr. Hewer has made promoting understanding between people his calling. And as I often say, understanding means looking at reality from the other person's perspective. And unless and until we are able to do that, I don't think we can become discerning and evolved human beings. So, in order to discuss understanding, cooperation, conflict, commonality, similarity, and theology, I welcome Dr. Chris Hewer to our show. Doctor, a very warm welcome to the program. I do understand that you have been traveling recently, and I have been traveling too. So I hope that the level of tiredness and the level of fatigue that I experienced in the recent days, you are not experiencing the same level of fatigue.
Thank you very much, Nadeem. I'm well and well rested. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
All right, then, Dr. Hewer, we will go straight to the questions. As I said in the introduction, you are a theologian. You've studied theology. What is theology? What questions does theology address, and what problems does it try to solve?
Well, we have here three different questions. So let's take the first one. Theology is the study of God and of things related to God. So theos, God, ology, to speak about theology. Therefore, there are different branches of theology. There would be scriptural theology or systematic theology that tries to work out and clarify doctrines on the basis of the sources. There would be moral theology. How does one live an upright, moral, godly life? And pastoral theology, for example, how does one as a pastor deal with the issues, the life events of other people? So secondly, then, what questions does theology address? Well, any question really related to this relationship between God and humankind.
God. When exactly did Jewish and Christian theology originate? And what was the need for this subject when the scriptures and religions were revealed?
Sorry, Nadeem, I was partway through your first question before you came in with the second one. So if we can go back to the first question, any element of the relationship between God and the created order, that means human beings and any other created being, these are the questions that theology tries to deal with. How to build a just society, how to live a godly life, and so on. The environment, environmental theology. And then finally you ask, what are the problems that it tries to solve? Well, the first problem, of course, is that God is utterly transcendent. God is not of this world. So whenever we speak about God, we are having to use earthly languages to speak about that which is transcendent and not of this earth. Now, therefore, this is the first problem. How can we speak about God in a not an adequate way, but with the least inadequacy. Theology is seeking to develop codes of speech. In other words, we are not trying to describe reality as though it were a teacup in front of us, but rather to develop a code of speaking which keeps us away from as many errors as possible. For example, how can we deal with the accountability of the human being while at the same time God is all-powerful? So these are the kind of problems that theology tries to deal with.
And at that point, is there an overlap between theology and philosophy? Because in philosophy also we deal with issues like how free are human beings, and also questions related to ethics.
Philosophy has a huge overlap with theology, with the exception that philosophy is not necessarily a godly practice. It can be an atheist, it can be a secular philosophy. But theology uses philosophy in order to make sure that we are thinking straight, that we are thinking sequentially, so that we make sure that we are as precise as possible by defining our terms and by moving forward. So philosophy is certainly overlapping with theology, but it can also stand on its own because it can be without a dimension of God.
That's very well put and very well explained. I think the difference between theology and philosophy and the similarities, they could not have been summed up so well in such a short uh, description. I have often been told, of course, some of the questions that I will raise here are not my own questions, but this is what the criticisms that I have heard over the years. Some people have said that what is the need or the use of a subject like theology or subjects like philosophy, or even, as you know, among the Arabs, they had subjects like the knowledge of Rijal, the knowledge of people or lineage, whatever. Now, this I've actually heard, because this question has been asked. What is the use of subjects like these when God has revealed everything to us?
Well, the first thing to say is that it is a characteristic of the human being that we have a capacity to think. It's one of the things that sets us apart from other creatures, as far as we know. Therefore, if we are thinking, we are in the business of philosophy. So it is a natural thing attached to being human. Secondly, it's all very well to say, well, God has revealed. The question, though, is what has God revealed? Because you'll know, for example, if we take the Quran often deals with a question in different places at different times in the 22-year period of its revelation. Therefore, we need to use our intellect to see when was this verse revealed, what was the sequence of the verses that were revealed, and therefore what is it trying to teach us? And that then is the business of theology. And then we have to say, well, how did the prophet interpret and understand that? How did he put it into practice in his community? So all the time we're using our reason, we're using our intellect to understand what exactly it is that God has revealed. Otherwise, we become something, well, frankly, less than human, because we're not engaging our human intellectual capacity.
Thank you very much. And as God has himself said, that direction and learning will come to you, to those who use their intellect. So so that is right. Now let's hop to today's world. This is a criticism of the yesteryears. In today's world, people will say that what is the use of theology in in an era which is marked by computer sciences, advances in the field of computer sciences and artificial intelligence.
Well, the first thing to say is that computers are tools. So every computer has been programmed by a human being. So they are not autonomous beings. They are tools that serve humankind. Now, they can serve us for good. We can think then of computer-assisted diagnostics, for example, in medicine, or they can serve us for ill. They can perfect weapons of mass destruction so that they will be more destructive of human life. Now, what is good, what is ill? This is the dimension then of the human being, of human reason, under the guidance of God, to work out what is morally acceptable, the ways in which we're going to use this machine. Now, one of the real challenges of artificial intelligence is the question whether or not this could develop to the extent of actually being freed from the control of its human programmers or its human designers and become an autonomous being in its own right. And this is one of the really critical elements in the contemporary discussion. We have also to face the fact that people are now talking about modifying the human brain, for example, modifying the human intellect by inserting a computer chip into our brains. Now, at what stage then do we cease to be human? At what stage is somebody else actually programming a chip and implanting it into my brain? Now, all these upstream thinkings, all these questions are the very matter of theology for the believer. They are the matter of philosophy for all thinking people.
And when you were talking about how we can take control of things, I thought about Calvinism and predestination that Calvin has discussed, but I'll come to that a bit later. Um, let's turn a little bit about to morality. What is morality, and how does it relate to theology, and what is morality's relevance in our world?
Morality is the science and action of living out a human life. Human beings are moral beings. That is, we have a free will, we have an ability to receive guidance and to think for ourselves. We have the will to put those thoughts into actions. So it is not possible to be a human being unless one is engaged with morality. Now, this morality can be secular amongst some people in the world today, but for the vast majority of humankind, this morality is in relation to the godly revelation that they have received. It is in relation to wanting to live an upright life according to the guidance of their scriptures, of their teachers, and of the traditions to which they belong. Therefore, morality and theology go together. We have to think and reason and find a way of speaking about how to live a decent, upright, and godly life. This would then give us the basis for that discipline of moral theology.
Let's now turn to a little bit about Christian theology. Let's first try to put the Bible into perspective. The first thing is, as you said, the Quran was revealed over a period of 23 years, and I think it is the only book which is available in the text in which it was revealed, the original language in which it was revealed. The Bible, I believe, of course, the Bible was revealed in Hebrew, but I believe the first translation was made in Greek and later on in Latin. So when we talk about over how many years was it compiled, first and foremost, how many books are there in the Bible when we talk about the New Testament and the Old Testament? How many books are there? Which books are common between Christians and Jews? And over how many years was the Christian Bible compiled and the Jewish Bible compiled? If you could just give us a little perspective, because in our culture, we have a misconception. We think of the Bible, or the Jewish Bible or the Christian Bible, in terms of like the Quran. It's like the one book that is there with 114 chapters or something like that. So just give us a little introduction to the Bible and the history of the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible.
Well, the first thing to say is that the Bible is quite unlike the Quran. We have to say that first of all, because the Bible is in effect a library of books which have various human authors. Those human authors come from a whole vast array of time. So we have oral tradition before things get written down. And then when we're talking about the written texts of the Bible, we're spanning a period of some 800 years. Now, these individual books have been edited and put together. They have been re-edited. They are sometimes composite, where you have several strands woven in together. They are of very different literary styles. Some are historical, some are historical, some are mythical, some lay down law, some are prophetic works trying to pull the people back to the original teaching. So a whole variety of different books, crucially with human authors, acting under what Christians would call divine inspiration. That is, God is guiding the authors in the totality of the books to guide human beings to convey that message which God wants to convey. So there is no understanding of Tanzil, for example, of a scripture sent down upon the prophet Abraham or the prophet Jesus, for example, and he received and transmitted that scripture. That is within a Muslim paradigm, not within a Christian paradigm. Now, having said that, Orthodox Jews believe that the first 5 books of the Bible, those books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 5 form the Torah, and they were given to Moses in a series of revelation, very much like the revelation of the Quran. But that is the belief of Orthodox Jews. It would not be a mainstream belief amongst Christian theologians. So now we're talking about a Christian Bible which has 2 parts. One part, which Christians often call the Old Testament or the First Testament, is also shared with the Jewish community. Now, the Jews would call this the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. That comprises 39 books in a whole variety of different genres. The other part then in the Christian Bible is the New Testament, and that composes 27 books, and again in a whole variety of different genres. Some of them are trying to draw out the teaching of Jesus and to present it to us, as in the Gospels. Some of them are trying to express that in the philosophical tradition of the Greeks to whom people are writing. For example, the writings of Paul. Sometimes you have historical works. Sometimes you have kind of visionary, mystical works of what things might be like in the in the future. Now, there is a core of these books which is agreed by all different Christian groups, but some different Christian groups will add a few extra, what we might call minor books. They are not of the core, they're not of the central teaching. So the Bible then, a composite of books with human authors under divine inspiration over a period of 800 plus years, very, very different from the Quran.
Very well explained. And when we talk about the revealed books, of course, the Quran starts in chapter 2, and it says that people should establish prayer. And one of the things that is required of them is that they have to believe in all the prophets and all the books that were revealed before the Quran. So when we talk about the books before the Quran, we have the Old Testament, the New Testament. Then we also have the Psalms. So what are the Psalms? And I believe the Psalms are called Zabur in Arabic. What are the Psalms and how are they related to the Bible?
Well, again, we have to be careful here because indeed the Quran talks about a scripture being revealed to the prophet David, which it calls the Zabur. But then there is a serious question: to what extent are the Psalms as they are contained in the Hebrew Bible a deposit of the Zabur or not? So what are the Psalms then? Well, there are 150 of them. They comprise a book of the Hebrew Bible, one of those 39. They were written by various different authors over a period of time. Some of them probably go back to the time of King David, but certainly others don't. Others are later additions. And if you wanted to ask a biblical theologian how best to understand them, he might say, well, they were the hymn book of the Second Temple. In other words, the temple that was built in Jerusalem after the return of the Hebrew people from exile in Babylon, so therefore in the 6th century before the Common Era. And there these psalms were sung as hymns, if you like, in the temple. So they comprise praise of God, giving thanks to God, seeking repentance and forgiveness, seeking guidance from God, a whole variety of different elements and genre there. Now that, I would suggest, is really quite different from what the Quran means when it says that Prophet David received the Zabur. So it is really not helpful to think of the Psalms as being the Zabur, although there could be some elements of the Zabur which are contained in the biblical Psalms.
And when we talk about the exile to Babylon, which of course I think is alluded to in chapter 17 of the Quran as the first raiders who came, and that would be Nabushat-Nasr. So when the Jews went there, and we heard poetry like "By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, yes, we cried when we remembered Zion." So does the Zionist, I don't want to get politics into this right now, but do the seeds of Zionism begin to appear in Babylon in the first exile?
Well, first of all, we need to know that Zion is a reference to a mountain in Palestine. It is then the mountain of Jerusalem, if you like, the mountain of God. Now, one of the things that is different between the Christian and Muslim on one side and the Jewish tradition on the other is that the Jewish tradition contains within its scripture an understanding that God has given to us, the Hebrew people, a particular piece of land. By contrast, both Christianity and Islam are universal religions. We are not bound to any particular piece of land at all. Now, for Jews then, to be in the land that God has given them becomes a central part of their thought. So naturally, when they are sent away or taken into exile, they are homesick. Their hearts are longing to be back in Palestine again, to be back in that land that they believe that God has given to them. And so this is a sense, a quest to go back. And it is, of course, the Persian king Cyrus who actually gives them permission to return, gives them the sacred vessels from the temple that have been taken from them, and sends them back with building materials to the land of Palestine, where they can then begin to build this second temple. So it's one of the key differences between Christianity and Judaism on the Christianity and Islam on the one hand, and Judaism on the other. Now, that is different from the secular modern Zionist movement, which is something that really grows up in the 19th century here in Europe. So we need to distinguish between those two.
It appears that Cyrus was a lot more evolved and open-minded, and Persia generally was more open-minded than Rome.
Well, Rome really isn't in the picture at this stage. And the thing about Cyrus is that he is a really good example that God can choose to use whomsoever God wills in order to be an instrument of God upon the earth. Cyrus is not a Jew. He's not a member of the Hebrew people. He is, as it were, a foreign king, and yet God can use Cyrus as his instrument to bring the people back to establish themselves once again in the land of Palestine. So God is not bound by these kind of human restrictions.
And as you said, Rome is not in the picture right now, but if we get Rome in the picture now, so Roman kings initially thought of Christianity as a threat, and or the Jews also didn't like the Christians in the beginning, and there is a reference to that in the Quran in chapter 85, where the subject of killing the Christians is alluded to again. So the question then is, I think for about 200 years or 250 years, the Christians are a persecuted faith. How do they rise? Why were they persecuted by the Jews? And how do they rise from a persecuted sect within Judaism to a world religion? What are the main contributing factors to the success of this religion?
We have to distinguish, first of all, between Roman persecution of Christians and what goes on between Christianity and Judaism. So let's deal with the Romans first. The Romans, of course, were essentially idol worshippers. They worshipped a whole series of gods, and at times they certainly worshipped their Caesars, their living rulers, as though they were living gods. And this then meant that the political system of the Roman Empire was completely at odds with Christianity, which taught the absolute otherness of God, the oneness of God, and that this sort of Caesar worship or idol worship was unacceptable. And that was the reason for the tension between Christianity and Rome. And that went on until one of the Roman emperors converted to Christianity. And then he began to, as it were, bring Christianity into the Roman imperial structure. And so there's a discussion as to whether he became a Christian or whether he turned Christianity into an organized Roman religion. That's another question. Now, if we go back to the relationship of Christianity with Judaism, the first thing to say is that Jesus and his immediate followers, as far as we can see and we can tell, were all Jews following the Jewish code of living, following the festivals, following the prayer rituals, following the dietary rules, etc. So they were Jews in every way at that time. Now, what then happens after the death and resurrection to eternal life of Jesus is that there starts to become a tension between the Christians and the Jewish establishment, because the Christians are wanting to say that Jesus was the Messiah, for example, and the Jewish establishment are saying, no, he wasn't. And so you're starting to get differences then around the person of Jesus. And then the question comes, to what extent are Christians required to fulfill all the requirements of the Jewish Sharia, as it were, the Jewish code of living? This particularly comes up with questions like keeping the Sabbath, circumcision of male babies, or the dietary laws, for example. Now, you start then to get this tension pulling the two communities apart. There are what we call push tendencies and pull tendencies. The push would be, if you say that, you are no longer a member of the Jewish community. If you say that Jesus was the Messiah, you are no longer a member of the Jewish community. And the pull factors would be that Christian leaders were saying, we do not think it any more necessary that we should circumcise boy babies, because the circumcision is the sign of belonging to the chosen community, the descendants of Abraham, and our tradition is a worldwide tradition and not restricted to a particular people. So you start to get this push and pull factor, and that then leads us into what we call the separation of the ways between the two communities. And that develops indeed more once we get deeper into the whole Christian theological tradition.
And at this point, we see the emergence of a person named Paul. And Saint Paul then becomes a savior of Christianity. So my understanding is that Saint Paul was Jew, and then he saw a miracle. He was initially very anti-Christian, and then he saw a miracle, and then he converted. So what is the impact of Saint Paul on early Christianity? If you could briefly discuss that, then we will go to Nicaea.
Paul certainly, as far as we're able to tell from his biographies, in other words, those things which are drawn from his own writings and the writings of others around him, Paul was an educated Jew, educated in the religious tradition, and he was zealous in this tradition. In other words, he was fully committed to following the Jewish way, to the extent that he was originally opposed to Christians, and indeed we're told that he had authority from the chief priests in Jerusalem to go Christian hunting to bring them in and to capture them. Now, Paul undergoes a religious experience, and he has a vision. He hears and he sees. Exactly what he sees is not revealed to us, but he has a vision which he identifies as being Jesus speaking to him, as it were, from heaven. Because now we are at least in the year 35, that is something like 3 to 5 years after the death of Jesus. And Paul's whole life is turned on its head by this experience. What he now does is to take himself off into the desert. And he spends something like 3 years in the desert in relative solitude, processing this experience, processing what he has heard about the Christian tradition, reflecting upon it from his Jewish tradition, and then coming to a deeper understanding of what God has done through the revelation in Jesus. And that enables him then to become, as it were, a fervent missionary, trying to spread the word of Christianity, especially around the Greek-speaking world. And because he is trained in, as it were, religious discourse and theology because of his Jewish background, because he also is from a Greek-speaking Jewish community and therefore has a knowledge of Greek, he is the first really who attempts to put the Christian message, in other words, to express Christian faith in ways that can be understood by a Greek-speaking, a Greek-educated audience. So in this sense, he becomes the first theologian. Now, it's important to remember that we have no evidence that Paul ever met the earthly Jesus. He certainly is dead before the first of the New Testament Gospels is compiled. So he has some stories about Jesus which would find their way into the Gospels, but he is not a compiler of other people's work. He is working on this revelation that he has received, working on his Jewish background, and seeking to express this new Christian faith that he has in a way that can be understood by his Greek-speaking audience. And that makes him a crucial person in trying to express what Christian faith is within that context.
And I think that the question of Trinity, the concept of Trinity, was also introduced by Paul. And speaking of Trinity, if you could explain to us what Trinity is, how is it important to Christian faith, and what is the difference between Christians who believe in Trinity and those who used to believe in unity, because up until the 19th century there was a sect called the Unitarians. So if you could just speak a little bit about Trinity.
The first thing to say is that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is worked out to defend the absolute oneness of God, the indivisibility of God, and the otherness of God. So it is very clear in Christian theology that God is one, eternal, indivisible, that God is unlike any creature. God is the creator. Now, it is to define and to defend that oneness of God. Now, it is therefore no part of Christian theology to say that anyone can be part of God, because God is indivisible, God cannot have parts. Nor is it possible to say that God shares divinity in a literal sense, because you cannot share a cake with yourself. You are one and not many. So this is the first principle. But the difficulty is this, you see, that when Christians came to reflect on the teaching of Jesus, on his life, on his example, on his lived reality, they came to see that he was something more than just a good teacher, more than just a prophet, more than just the awaited Messiah of the Jews. So what was he then? Well, he did things and he said things that actually tipped over into the preserve of God. In other words, he does not say, I will pray to God and ask that God will forgive you, but he pronounces forgiveness of sins. He takes it upon himself to actually change some elements of the Jewish code, the code of Moses. Now, only God can do this. And so, who is this person? So you see, what we're then doing is that we are seeking a formula of words to speak about Jesus, which absolutely does not lead us into polytheism of saying here are two gods, because that's completely unacceptable both to Judaism and to Christianity. Therefore, what they do is that they go back into the Hebrew scriptures. Now, these are the scriptures written hundreds of years before the time of Jesus. And they find there a title, a concept, which is called Son of God. And 4 groups of creatures or people are referred to as sons of God. The first of these is the angels. The angels are called sons of God. They are perfectly obedient to God. They are the servants of God in all things. Secondly, the whole Hebrew nation is called sons of God. When they are perfectly obedient to God and when they live as nearly as possible according to the divine command. Thirdly, there are kings who are called sons of God. Now, not all kings, only those kings who rule in the name of God, according to the guidance of God, when they represent God to the people, when they represent the people before God. And crucially here, we are told on the day of the king's coronation, today I have begotten you. You are son of God. Now, this is not a newborn baby. We're not talking biology when we talk about sons of God. God does not go around having babies and boy babies then become sons of God. That is nonsense. Far exalted is God above having children. Now, therefore, we're not talking biology. What are we talking? Well, the fourth category of people who are given the title Son of God in the Hebrew scriptures are those who are called the righteous ones, those whose life is so deeply imbued with the teaching of God, that it is as though they make God manifest in their lives. When we look at you, it is as though we see the teaching of God manifest before our eyes. Now, if you put those four together, those four different categories, then you can get some idea of what is the content of the title Son of God according to Christian theology. Now, that content, which is taken from the Hebrew scriptures, is then applied to Jesus. And Jesus is seen to be that unique Son of God. Therefore, as it were, capital S, capital G, not like the rest, but something uniquely different, and therefore in a unique way given the title Son of God. Now we know that Jesus speaks of God as Father. This again is not at all a new invention. This is there in the Hebrew scriptures. God is like a father to his people. You are in Pakistan. We could call Quaid-e-Azam the father of the nation. This is not a biological title. That would be nonsense. But there is a profound sense in which he was the father of the founding of the nation of Pakistan. So we are using these words in a figurative sense with real meaning, but not talking biology. Now, thirdly, something happens after the death and resurrection to eternal life of Jesus, because the infant Christian community at this stage are in a state of deep shock. They are hiding from the Jewish authorities. What they did to Jesus, they could do to us. Let's keep out of daylight. Let's keep inside behind locked doors. And so they are some 6 weeks later when the next Jewish feast comes round, which is the Feast of Pentecost. And on this occasion, something happens. It fundamentally transforms these early Christians from being timid, afraid to look out of the door, to being filled with courage, to be filled with power, to be able to go out and to spread the message in the street, in the marketplace. Now, how were Christian theologians to try to talk about this? Well, again, they go back into the Hebrew scriptures. And in the Hebrew scriptures, we find there the concept of the ruh, the ruh of God. And the ruh, the ruach in Hebrew, is both the breath, the wind that blows, and the Spirit of God. Now, this Spirit of God, this wind, is the most powerful thing that nomadic people can know, because the desert storm appears and you don't know it's coming. It changes the landscape around you. It's so powerful. You don't know where it's coming from. You don't know where it's going to. All you can do is to get your head down and hope to live through it. But what you cannot do is to deny its presence and its power. This then is the desert wind. This is the ruach, the ruh of God. This then is the title that they give to this power, which is exhibited in the lives of this early Christian community on the day of Pentecost. So now we have three different aspects, as it were. We are talking about the fatherhood of God. We're talking about Jesus in this unique capacity of revealing God to us, making God manifest, opening the way for human beings to come into a new relationship with God. And we're talking about the power that is unleashed in the heart of the human being in order to go out and to serve God. Now, this then is the rudimentary elements of the Christian doctrine of Trinity. One God with three different, well, the best translation that I can use is to say modes of being. Now, what are modes of being? Well, you are a man. You are the son of your father. This is one mode of being. You are the husband of your wife. This is another mode of being. You are the father of your children. This is a third mode of being. But there's only one of you. So one only person, three different modes of being. And this is what Christian theology seeks to try to develop as a code of speech in talking about God. This is how we end up with a doctrine of the Trinity.
I had been thinking about and researching, at least for the last 10 years, uh, the ayat in the Quran which says, uh, the Jews say that Ezra is the son of God. And I could not understand that. But today, after listening to your explanation, the four categories of sons of God, this has become clear to me. Why would the Quran say that Ezra was the son of God? Um, coming to this chapter 9 of the Quran, I will stick to the Judeo-Christian discussion, but because this has come up, so I'm going to raise this. I have to come to Islam and to the later times. But the ayah in the Quran, which has been used by extremists on all sides to justify whatever they wanted to do. Of course, I find chapter 9 of the Quran, Surah Tawbah, a beautiful chapter. It has a lot of lessons and a lot of things which are very useful to us. Of course, according to the Tanzil, it is the 113th chapter according to the Tanzil, but it's chapter 9. So in chapter 9, there is this ayat which says, the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, while the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. Such are the baseless assertions, only parroting the words of earlier disbelievers. May Allah condemn them. How can they be deluded? So, when someone reads ayats like these, obviously, I was having a discussion with someone and he was criticizing Islam, and it was a and she was criticizing, and she was saying that in the Quran it says that the testimony of two women will be equal to the testimony of one man. So so Islam does not treat women equally. And I said, look, what you are talking about is in the context of the ayat of the loan, which is in chapter 2, where God says that if you take a loan, bring one witness who's a man, and two if there's a woman. And I said it really depends on the context, because you are referring to the ayat of the loan, which is a business transaction. If you go to Surah Nur, God says that if 4 men testify that a woman has committed something wrong, and the woman turns around and swears by Allah and says, no, I haven't, then the testimony of the woman will trump the testimony of those 4 men. So the thing in the scriptures is that it really depends on the context. In any case, if when people read ayahs like these, and you are a Christian theologian, when you read this ayat, how did you react, and how do people react to this? And how should they take this? How should they react to such ayats?
Well, first of all, we have established what the meaning of the title Son of God means in the case of Ezra, for example. He was a pious Jew. He was outstanding in his piety, and therefore he was referred to in some ways as a son of God. Secondly, we've already established that we are not talking biology. Now, this is absolutely crucial, because often when Muslims read in the Quran anything about Jesus and Son of God, they think we're talking biology, which just makes nonsense. What we are trying to do, though, is to establish a relationship, a formula of words, a code of speech to speak about the relationship between Jesus and God. Now, that doesn't mean that we can put all these right if only we understand. There have been some very, very smart Muslim and Christian theologians over the centuries who have sat down and perfectly understood what the other is saying, because they were both using Arabic as mother tongue and they were both using Aristotelian philosophy, so they understood each other perfectly, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily agreed with each other. So we need to accept that there are differences in beliefs between Islam and Christianity. And on the day of judgment, God will make clear those things that we could not sort out here in this life. When I read a sentence like this that we find in Surah 9, then I am seeing that as being a reference to biology, because you will remember that in the idol worshipping times, the Jahiliyyah of Mecca, there were those daughters of God. And we have verses in the Quran that actually are critical in this regard and saying, you want sons for yourself and you ascribe daughters to me. So there cannot be here a sense of Jesus being a biological son of God. Rather, this is a title which is given to him. And so this is different from what it appears on the surface, which is a question of biology. You will know, for example, that the Quran uses two words for son, one which is walid, which is a biological term, and then the term ibn. And ibn can be used also in a figurative sense, as we would use father in a figurative sense when we talk about Qaid-e-Azam being the father of the nation, or we could say of someone that he is so much the son of his father, or so much the son of the ideology of the nation. This is a figurative sense, and this could be then the way in which ibn can be used.
And even for parents, like when the Quran says, Rabbana kfirli wali walidayya, so the wali walidayya is referring to the biological parents, whereas when Abraham talks about his uncle, he also refers to him as father, but there that word is not used. So absolutely. And to the listeners as well, if you were thinking that the Christians believe that God has a biological son, like a DNA or something, that's not the shirk. That's not the shirk that they are doing. All right. So thank you very much for clarifying that, and I will move definitely to the next question. What happens, very briefly now, what happens at Nicaea? Suddenly this faith, apparently Constantine also saw a miracle. Something came from the heaven and he saw it. What's the background of Constantine, and why does he accept Christianity?
Well, we're told that Constantine was in a battle situation, and he had a vision of a cross in the sky, and he interpreted this as being a divine vision to say that God was on his side. He would win the victory. When he did win, he then decided he would become a Christian. So Christianity went, as it were, almost overnight from being a persecuted anti-Roman tradition to being the religion of the emperor, and therefore the religion of the Roman Empire. Now, there was a great deal of uncertainty and discussion amongst the early Christian theologians as to the nature of Jesus, the doctrine of the Trinity, the relationship between God and Jesus. All these questions were not nice and neatly sorted out from the very beginning. The Bible, as we have seen, is unlike the Quran. It is not a book of doctrine. It is not a book of law. It is a deposit of, the Gospels recount and tell the story of the teaching of Jesus and the life of Jesus. But it's actually up to the Christian leaders, the Christian theologians, the bishops, to actually work out, through using their reason and using their intellect, how do we express what is our Christian faith? And this they do, but not surprisingly, they come up with different answers. So there were some who said that, well, Jesus was not divine, he was just a jolly good super prophet. There were some who said, well, he wasn't truly human. He was just appearing to be human, and he was like a ghost inside a human machine. And you had all sorts of different traditions amongst Christians at this time. Now, in order to decide what is orthodox mainstream Christian belief, the Christian tradition has the vehicle of a council. A council means that you summon together your leading scholars, your bishops and others, and you get them to sit together and work it out, and then to agree upon a formula that they then say this is Orthodox Christian belief. Now, that is what happens at Nicaea. When the leading theologians get together, they debate and discuss these things. Some do not agree. Some of those who do not agree in the end come round and say, okay, yes, I now see what you're saying, I do agree. And others say, no, I persist in my minority opinion, and I'm going to go off and I'm going to continue in my tradition. So there are Christian traditions that separate from the mainstream Orthodox position, and they become minority traditions. Some of them become very large, like the church that was based in Iraq, that went all the way up the Great Spice Road into China and so on. Others become very small and they drop off the pages of history. Now, you asked earlier on about Unitarians as opposed to Trinitarians, for example, but you were slightly mistaken there in thinking that the Unitarians ceased to exist in the 19th century. Quite to the contrary, there is a group who are explicitly called the Unitarians, who are created, who are come into existence during this period from the 17th century onwards, who say that, in effect, our fathers were Trinitarians, but we do not accept this as a rational doctrine. This is not the way in which we think about God. So therefore, we're moving from a Trinitarian position Often they moved to what we call a binitarian position. That is, they said that, God, a doctrine not of Trinity, but of binity, that is God and Jesus, but leaving the Holy Spirit out of it. And then they come finally to a position where they say that Jesus is not divine, God alone is divine. And so we have that classical Unitarian position. And that continues in the West today. It is certainly in Britain and Europe a very small community. They are called the Unitarians. They are somewhat larger in the United States, where they are often called the Unitarian Universalists. And they become much more plural in their theology. And the Universalist part of that name is to say, to incorporate other faith traditions under their umbrella. And therefore, they can read from the poems of Tagore, for example, in their meetings for worship, very much as they would read from the Bible.
And are these Unitarians that you referred to, are they the same as the Gnostic sect of Iraq, or the Sabians that the Quran refers to?
Well, we're not entirely sure who the Sabians were. When the Quran talks about Sabians, the best scholarly interpretation today seems to be that they are the Mandeans. Now, the Mandeans still exist as a very tiny group in Iraq, and they are essentially the followers of the prophet John, and Christians would say John the Baptist. So they seem to be the Sabians referred to in the Quran, just as the Magians referred to in the Quran are generally held to be the Zoroastrians of Persia. So they are different in that regard. The Gnostics, Gnostic means hidden knowledge. It means special knowledge which is not available to those who are uninitiated. And that's quite a separate grouping, quite a separate interpretation to the Unitarians. The Unitarians would be much more rational, much more talking of exoteric knowledge, not of esoteric knowledge.
I must say that we have completed our first hour, but I have not completed the first part of my question. So we will stop whenever you want to, and then we will continue in some other session. But I will come to one question. The Jews do not accept Jesus as the Mashiach, or they call the Mashiach or Messiah. But they do accept Simon Bar Kokhba as the Messiah. Later on, they accept another person as a Messiah, and then there's a revolt, and that revolt is crushed, and then that basically creates the weakness, which ultimately leads to the conquest of Jerusalem in the time of the second caliph. So my question would be, why did the Jews not accept Jesus when they were waiting in anticipation for the coming of a Messiah, and they accepted Simon Bar Kokhba 125 years later?
Well, the first thing to say is that there were many, let's say, pretend messiahs who were around during this period. Remember that the Hebrew nation is living under persecution and oppression in Palestine at this time. They are taxed, they are abused, they are at times prevented from the practice of their faith. They are at times under pressure to worship idols. So the The Romans are the hated oppressors of the people, and it's no surprise that there are people who rose up at this time and declared themselves to be the Messiah and said to the people, "Come and follow me." So many messiahs around at this period. The Jews of that time have an expectation. When the Messiah comes, there will be certain signs associated with it. Now, some of those Jesus fulfilled. The hands of the Messiah will be the hands of the healer. So we see him working many healing miracles. In the day of the Messiah, there will be a superabundance of food, and we see him producing food in great quantities to feed people. So there were real questions in the mind of some of his followers. Could it be that this is the Messiah? But the difference is that the expectation at that time was that when the Messiah came, he would rise up sword in hand, and he would militarily rout the Romans, rout the oppressors, and drive them out of the land. And Jesus refuses to do this. He refuses to use military force, and therefore he fails in this fundamental expectation of the Jewish leaders of that time, and therefore he is not accepted as the Messiah. Now, this tradition of there being lots of messiahs carries on after the time of Jesus too. So Simon Bar Kokhba, for example, is one of those who sets himself up and claims to be the Messiah, and he calls for another revolt, and this is then associated with the final push by the Roman authorities to drive the Jews out of the land of Palestine. When I was a student of theology, I studied for some time with a professor who was a rabbi, a Jewish scholar. And one of the students, in the way that students do, asked him, "Professor, why won't you Jews accept that Jesus was the Messiah?" And what he did was very illustrative. He went to the window of the seminar room, he opened it, looked up and down the street, and said, "I see no signs." Because when the Messiah comes, then justice and peace will rule upon the earth. I see no signs of justice and peace, therefore the Messiah has not yet come. Just in the same way that we find false Mahdis arising within the Islamic tradition. And if you want to work up a rebellion against hated oppressors, you proclaim yourself to be the Mahdi, people come to your side, and then either you get killed and they get killed too, or perhaps you truly are the Mahdi, and then of course there will be a huge change in society. If that change has not come about, that is proof positive that the Mahdi has not come. And so both for Islam and for Judaism, the test is, has the world changed fundamentally and radically? Do justice, equity, and peace rule the earth? If not, the Messiah hasn't come.
And surely there have been false Mahdis, at least in the last 100 years, we have seen quite a few. Once in Africa, once in Saudi Arabia. So yeah, absolutely correct. One or two questions before we finish today's session, and then we will see how we will cover all these areas. The Jews are looking for their Messiah, the Messiah. And at the time of the coming of Islam, I'm not yet in that period. I'm not discussing that period in detail, but because this has come up, in the time that Islam comes, 610 AD, There are a lot of Jews in Medina, in Mecca, around Mecca, and also in Medina. Why are the Jews there exactly? Because the Jews are supposed to be the Israelites. They are supposed to be in Jerusalem. Why did they come all the way there? Were they looking for the Messiah? And if they were looking for the Messiah, why did they not accept, just like they had rejected Jesus? Why did they not accept the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as their Messiah?
Well, we can say that it is a constitutional position of Jews worldwide in all times to be ready and to be looking for the coming of the Messiah. However, we also have to get on with life. Now, why are they down in the Arabian Peninsula? Because they have been driven out of Palestine. So after the Bar Kokhba revolt, we're looking at 132, 135 of the Common Era. The Jews are overwhelmingly driven out of Palestine. Still, a small group are able to remain there, but the rest are scattered. That's why we find Jews along the coast of North Africa and up into Spain. We find them around the Eastern Mediterranean and up into Turkey. We find them down into Iraq and Iran, for example, but we also find that some went down into the Arabian Peninsula. Now, we know that there were at least 3 Jewish clans who were present in Medina in the time of the Prophet. And we know that the Prophet understood himself to stand in that line that included the Hebrew prophets, going all the way back through however many, the 124,000, to ultimately to Adam. And so it was almost automatic for him when he arrived in Medina that the first thing he did was to go and meet the heads of the Jewish clans and to say, in effect, gentlemen, I am a new prophet sent by God. Now, why didn't they accept him? Because it is contained in the Hebrew scriptures that prophets arise in the house of Israel. That is, in the house of that line of descent from Abraham and Sarah through Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, etc. So this is not Israel the land, this is Israel the name of the person. In other words, they are saying to him, you have the wrong genealogy. You are coming down the line of Ishmael, not the line of Isaac. And as far as our scriptures are concerned, prophets arise in the house of Isaac, the house of Israel. And therefore they didn't accept him. And that is the difficulty then. It's not to do with being Messiah. It is accepting him as a prophet of God or not.
So in the Jewish texts, the solitary reason, the only reason for rejecting the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the wrong genealogy. He's not in that bloodline of Israel. That's the only reason. There are no other reasons.
Well, to say it's the only reason actually is to diminish its importance, because if you do not accept that the prophet was a prophet of God, then the Quran loses its status and its revealed nature. And therefore, which leg do you have left to stand on? You neither have the prophet nor the Quran, and so therefore you have completely cut the foundations out from underneath. There are, of course, other reasons of tension between the revelation in the Quran and the Jewish community, because the Quran says that something has happened to the Jewish scriptures. Bits have been added, bits have been lost, bits have been changed. And as you know, even in one verse, their rabbis have written verses with their own hand and ascribe them to God in order that they can make a small profit by them. Now, this is, of course, deeply offensive to the rabbis and to Judaism. So there are real elements of tension there, but not to accept the prophet means you're not accepting the Quran as being a divine revelation, and therefore the two fundamental building blocks of Islam are swept out from underneath you. So it's not an only, as though it were a small thing. It is a fundamental thing.
Thank you for stressing that this is the most fundamental thing, and if this small bit is taken away, then everything is taken away. Last question, last topic for today, and then we will continue as we see the coming of Islam and then the Muslim-Christian relations as they evolve, especially during the Middle Ages. When Rome was sacked, when Jerusalem was sacked by Titus Flavius and his father Vespasian, we see two kinds of people, a debate taking place within Jerusalem, and this is what we've got from General Josephus's memoirs of the Jewish revolt, that there are certain people in Jerusalem who are saying that, look, we have brought the Romans to a position where we can negotiate with them and get terms. And then there is another group of people who say that we can liberate this very small piece of land which is surrounded on all sides by Romans, by the sword, and we can do it. And ultimately there's a tension within Jerusalem, and the extremists kill, I believe the name of the leader was Hanan bin Hanan. Hanan bin Hanan is killed by the extremists. The extremists take over, and then the Romans come into Jerusalem. They destroy everything. And when the extremists see Roman power, then they realize what they were up against. This is so reminiscent, and this is so similar to what has happened on October 7th, where some people thought that they would force a bigger power which surrounded Gaza from all sides, and they could take the land back. So we will discuss this in detail in the next session, but today I just want to discuss briefly extremism. I think what happened in Jerusalem that day when the extremists took over, the extremism in its most stark form. So there is something called passion in religion. Passion, I believe, is a good thing, and it's a part of religion. How does one distinguish that from extremism? Where does passion become extremism? And how can we keep these two together? How can we keep these two apart from each other? Where passion is there, but extremism is not. So how do you deal with that as a person and as a believer?
Passion, first of all, is a necessary consequence and outpouring of faith. If I truly believe that God exists, that God calls me into a relationship with God, that God calls me to follow a certain way, a certain set of practices, God does not call me to be lukewarm in my following. Rather, God calls me to be wholehearted in my following. Now, Islam, for example, like Christianity, does not say, well, the test is, what do you think? The test is, what do you do? Do you put it into practice? Not in a half-hearted way, but in a full-throated way, in a way which is passionate. Now, if I say that I love God with the whole of my being, with the whole of my heart, the whole of my mind, the whole of my senses. And that then brings me into a passionate following. That passion can lead me to do things which in the eyes of the world would appear to be extreme. If we think, for example, Jesus goes forward to his death in Jerusalem, knowing that he is going to be killed, and he allows himself to be killed by his enemies. If we think of Imam Hussein, for example, before he leaves Medina, he goes to visit his grandfather in his grave, and he has there a vision in which he learns that his life will be forfeit, and the lives of his followers and his friends and his family, and that his children will either be killed or will be put into chains. Now, to go forward in that knowledge to one's ultimate death would appear in the eyes of the world to be extreme. And yet we would say that this is passionate devotion from the servants of God to fulfill the will of God in every detail. You remember the story of Abraham's call to sacrifice Ishmael in the Quran, when he is told, tell Ishmael that I have told you to sacrifice him, and see what he thinks. And what does Ishmael say? He says, I am not the author of my life. If it be the will of God, you will find in me an obedient servant. So in the eyes of the world, this can seem like an extreme thing. So how then do we distinguish this kind of passion from what we often will experience in the world that we will call extremism? This passion is in accordance with the ongoing divine revelation, the ongoing tradition of that religion. It is not something that we have dreamt up and called Islam. So when we think about a group like ISIS, for example, one of the most important things that ISIS provoke is to draw together Muslim scholars from all different schools, from many different countries, and they write a solemn declaration that you have no Islamic leg to stand on, that what you are doing is condemned by the Quran, by the Prophet, and by the ongoing tradition of Islam. That makes them extremists. They are outside the parameters of what is acceptable. However, those who are passionate, even to the point of being willing to embrace martyrdom, are within the tradition, both of Christianity and of Islam. That in both Christianity and Islam, those who lose their life for the sake of what is true and what is right and what is upright in living, those are the martyrs. They are called to martyrdom by God. They are therefore in accordance with the teaching of the ongoing, the revelation, the prophet, the ongoing tradition. That's what makes the difference. And therefore, passion is a necessary good. If we are not passionate, then we are lukewarm, and God does not call us to be lukewarm.
So in summary, it would be fair to say that a person who's passionate will calculate the consequences and the bad consequences of his right actions for himself, and he will embrace those consequences as a means to getting closer to God, while an extremist will not even care about the consequences that will happen, not as much to himself but to others. I mean, the extremist will not take into account anything. He will not be concerned about results. Was that a fair way of putting it?
I think that certainly is part of it, but there's another important part. Martyrdom, for example, is not something that I decide upon. Martyrdom is what happens to me when I take a stand in the name of God, in the name of what is right and true, etc., and you kill me. That's what distinguishes martyrdom from suicide, for example. In martyrdom, You kill me, and you kill me because of my stand on uprightness, truth, and on the nature of God. So God calls the person to martyrdom. It is not something that I decide I am going to do. It is God who calls me into that expression of perfect faith.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hewer. We will have to have a second sitting because I've only completed the first part. We still have to discuss the coming of Islam, Christian-Muslim relations as they developed, and contemporary issues which are very important related to morality as well as economic exploitation and political issues, especially now that we've had elections in the UK and we are looking forward to elections in the United States. So we will we will sit together once again, and very shortly we will be announcing the date of our next meeting with Dr. Hewer. I believe that Dr. Hewer, you have to travel in the coming days. So whenever you are back, we will have a second sitting, and we are going to uh, definitely continue this, because this is not complete. In fact, today we've just laid the framework, and we need to, because I wanted to discuss some chapters from the Quran and some supplications and the importance of developing a connection with God. That was the main thing. But just by setting the framework, it took so much time. So thank you very much, Doctor. I really enjoyed our discussion. It was I can see now that we've been speaking for the last 1.5 hours, and I did not feel that so much time had lapsed. So any final thought from you, and then we will wait for our next meeting.
Thank you very much, Nadeem. It was a great pleasure to be able to speak with you today and to clarify some of these issues. I'm certainly willing that we should have another session and perhaps even another one after that, depending on how much time we need. Yes, it's true that I'm traveling, and it's also true that I'm going to Arba'in, I'm going to Iraq this year. So I hope that between my next trip and my trip to Iraq, we'll be able to arrange a date later in August. Thank you very much for today, and inshallah, there will be another occasion when we can meet and talk again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a very nice day. Thank you very much indeed. And please remember us in your prayers. Bye-bye.